On this episode of the podcast, I have with me Vijay Sankararaman. He is a product and technology leader in the consumer tech space. We're going to be talking about low churn and high impact team culture. We're going to dive into a couple of different areas like building vision, buying into that vision, understanding the individual person. How do you avoid churn? I think that's a big factor within the technology space, and Vijay is going to talk to us about how he manages that, and also impact, and what does high impact mean? And if you do have the right cultural mix, what can go wrong? What are things that you have to worry about? Vijay, thanks for being on the show.
Amit, thank you for having me today. It's been wonderful. It's a great time to be talking about low churn, high impact. We all just literally woke up, most of us, watching recently concluded Super Bowl. As many would attest, it's a team sport. Technology is team sport, as evident in the most recent game we saw. Each and every player has to look over his shoulder or her shoulder in many cases and say, hey, what sort of strength am I playing with? What sort of opportunities am I playing with, and how do I, cover for that or exhibit my strength? That's going to get a win for the team. That's going to get the W that matters. When we think about technology, I think that's exactly the same.
Absolutely. All right, we're going to dive into this topic. As we're talking about, obviously, low churn and high impact, I think a lot of people understand what low churn means. I think the term high impact, when we referenced teams, means different things to different people. And I guess it depends what you define as impact. I guess when you are considering this topic, to speak about this topic, what does high impact mean?
End of the day, corporations are out there to serve the customers, to meet the needs of the shareholders, stakeholders, and obviously, represent a purpose. So when I think about that, an impact, particularly a high impact, refers to the outcomes that the team goes after in a unified manner and delivers them, or rather over-delivers them, to the joy of the customer. That represents high impact.
All right, that's a very specific marker. I guess, to develop a low churn, high impact team culture, I mean, they need to start with, as you said, it's a team sport. Everyone needs to be bought into something similar. A lot of times we've got to start with this quote unquote vision, make sure everyone understands where our destination is. When you're talking about a team and you're talking about team culture, what do you do? What have you done in the past to help make sure that the team is bought into the vision? They're on the same team.
So that, if you think about it, when we all been part of the teams, we all remember being part of the team where we felt we are part of the team, and we also remember, at least many of us, that we were not quite, included, if you will. So there is a subtle factor that I always introspect when I look to my own team, 360, right? Up, down, sideways. Who am I being part of? And in the world where we think about as a team, what is the culture? What is the element that ties us together, right? And a lot of us, in the end, want to validate, am I being valued? And it's that single question, I think, that separates between, are you part of the team? Are you going to be adding value to the team? Are you going to be a representative of the team? Or are you not? So getting that question answered, getting that, the what makes that tick, the valuation part is what I go after.
I guess that's very important. And I guess from a team perspective, I mean, obviously teams are comprised of individuals. When you are trying to understand what makes the team work, you have to understand the individual. When you're trying to understand the individual in this case, obviously there are different people that might have different interests, different goals. When you're trying to understand those goals and you're trying to align it to your team, because obviously you want that, happy, productive team. Talk to us a little bit about what you do to ensure that the individual goal is aligned to the team goal, but also has still value for the individual, because obviously each individual has to find value.
In almost any novelty of sort, any engagement of sort, there is a level of excitement or sort of let's just say energy burst in the beginning. A new member joining the team or a new project that has been unveiled. Talk about AI, talk about automation, what have you. Right? Technology is always in a Boolean space. Now, I'll steal a quote from Angela Duckworth, the author of Grit, that I popularly refer to. Right? Enthusiasm is common, endurance is rare. And what I mean by that, and how I apply when I look at the individual seeking valuation, is the enthusiasm that every individual exhibits or their leader exhibits during an initial expose. How can that be sustained? What makes it sustained? What makes a team gel more than just the first few minutes of kumbaya? What makes them gel beyond just the first few weeks of sort of getting together? As you will agree with me, I mean, everybody comes back from a yearly a yearly meetup or a quarterly rah-rah moments. The first few hours or days after that moment, it's awesome. Everybody talks about it. But in some cases, that wanes. In few cases, that sustains. And the trigger point, what I've generally found is that each and every individual, myself included, we all have a motive and a sub-motive in what we want to accomplish in the organization, right? And growth is defined different for different people. Having to understand what that individual or the intrinsic value that each and every individual holds to the word growth, to my earlier comment, valuation to the growth. Am I valued? Am I growing? Growth doesn't necessarily always mean, sort of a title or an accomplishment of sort, but growth means different things, right? Understanding that and applying the same intrinsic value that the associate puts. And then as a leader, how can I help light the fire to that intrinsic value? How can I help sort of connect myself to the individual? In some cases, Amir, that the motivation that the associate has in terms of growth, in some cases, may not necessarily fit with the overall organizational growth or the team, and the transparency in declaring that, the level of authenticity that both the leader and the team member in this case demonstrating each other sets the difference between how can that enthusiasm that began sustains from an endurance perspective.
I guess when you're looking at the team and obviously avoiding churn's hard, but also I think it ties into what you were even talking about. You have to understand the individual. You have to understand what makes them tick. I mean, it is also you're executing at a higher level, executing against the team's productivity. When you are thinking about that churn piece and the importance of understanding the individual, how much of a variance can you have between individuals and their goals and the team, right? So at some point, if individuals' goal is just too far off, that person might not be helping you, create that high impact team culture. Obviously, you'd like them to get there, but talk to us about that variance, because I think that, obviously everybody is out to do well on the team, but everyone wants individual, satisfaction. They want their individual glory. They want to do well, all those things from their own perspective as well. How do you balance that?
There are some responsibilities, or let's just say the accountability of a leader, and then accountability of as an individual to the team. It's a spoken, in many cases, Amir, an unspoken sort of transaction. And in that spirit of it, one of the things I've seen generally span well for me, and even learning from some of the leaders I've been part of, is that moment of what do you call it, as a social freedom within the group? Am I being safe? Am I being safe enough to declare? Am I vulnerable as a leader to sort of, let my guard down and tell my employee, tell my associate, hey, here's what I can do, cannot do. Here's where I have succeeded, where I've failed. And you as a associate in the company, how can you shed your ego, shed your fears, and then of course, feel comfortable enough that you are able to demonstrate what your sort of goals and needs and wants are, and how and then validate against what the leader's goals are. It's a matter of validation, right? And both sides there is a validation, and the validation is successful when there is trust. How can that currency of trust be exchanged between the two parties, or in this case, if it's a team, how many ever makes up the team? How can that be done? And me as a leader, my prima facie responsibility is how do I facilitate those moments? Facilitate those moments over and above what the company gives me in terms of, hey, let's all have a quarterly, performance reviews or what have you, right? How do you transcend beyond that and establish those moments of trust exchange? Allowing the associate to let his or her guard down, letting you let your guard down, and have that moment of vulnerability, creating the opportunity to have good exchange. And to your point, those are the moments when if there is a mis-expectation or a misplaced purpose lies, they can be sorted out. However, they need to be sorted out.
I like that. And I guess, we were going to talk about problems, and maybe this is a good segue to that is, if you're going to have problems in a high performing team culture, right, high impact team culture, where do those problems, I think you started talking about them a little bit in your previous response, but where do some of those problems start coming up?
Yeah. Admittedly, we're all striving to a frictionless conversation, a continued frictionless conversation. But the reality is there will have to be a set of a healthy chaos, as I would call it. And as a leader, it's important to actually create a healthy chaos moments, right? There is no victory in a discussion without a disruption in the mix. Whether it is subtle or overt, that has to happen. So in one of the ways I've also seen happen through Amir is that literally taking a page out of the book as to how a product technology leader sort of interacts with their overall stakeholder, whoever they are. It's the element of culture of curiosity. How do I ask the right questions? How do I go after defining the right questions versus defining all the solutions to the problem, right? Framing that, the set of questions, spending 95% of the time asking the questions, leaving the 5% to what the answer is. If I use the same page in my day in and day out interactions with any and all people I work with, that doesn't mean I bury them with questions. I'm an active listener. Practice active listening. Practice asking questions that are a lot more meaningful than topical. Right? So those things I've generally seen yield better results.
I think when we're talking about high impact, it really is a component of consistent delivery at a certain level, right? When you're working with your team, so obviously we've talked about low churn, we've talked about understanding the individual. To define that high impact, there needs to be a bar, there needs to be a metric, there needs to be an expectation of some factor being consistently achieved. I guess when you're working and you're managing your teams and you're trying to drive that culture you're looking for, how do you establish that bar, that consistency, so that we can get to high impact?
Yeah. So again, that's a great way, right? So here is one mental exercise I generally try to do with my teams, right? Beginning of the year, typically, the fiscal plans have announced, and you sort of had generally if there is any a remix of the team and all that has happened. So what I normally do, call it the first meeting of the year, if you will. All my key directs and all my key leaders within the team, get them into the room, hat them up, have an icebreaker moment, but then group them up together and have sort of a series of solve the sleuth puzzles. May sound little elementary for lack of a better word, but crime puzzles or solve the sleuth puzzles. And then come back later part of the year, solve a similar set of puzzles, and almost every year, virtually every year, the second time we do it, even with the shift of the teams within for the fun of it, they all fare well. They all seem to enjoy more. Now, of course, you take some element of catch me by surprise, a new player in the mix, or why am I doing this? It sounds too elementary and all that. But as the time rolls by doing it again, they get into the gist of it. They say, now the reality, the truth of doing this is to shed your inhibitions. Each realizes, and the way that questions are, each realizes they don't have to be good at everything. You don't have to be good at everything, and you're not going to be graded by being good at everything. I play with them to prove a point that I'm not good at everything. In fact, I'm probably good at very little things, but I'm relying on you guys as a team to get that. And you're right, Amir, there's always going to be one or two, let's call it the skewed person out of the mix, but leave that aside. But the norm basically guides us for the team to say, this is just the way you gel, is not because you're perfect. The way you gel because you seek. You don't go in there with perfection, seeking perfection. You go in there seeking collaboration. You get your answers.
So I guess when you're talking about, I guess we've been talking about this concept of having a low churn, high impact. When you're talking about that collaboration, we've talked about the vision, having everyone be on the same page, having that focus. I actually want to talk about your role, right? Your role is also instrumental here because you're dealing with issues at a different lens. You're dealing with other stakeholders. You're communicating with your team. What you communicate sometimes is exceptionally important because too little or too much can potentially impact what your team is operating on. You act as that filter to a degree. In your role acting as that filter, how do you decide, obviously, what to convey to your team when it comes to some of the decisions being made outside their viewpoint? And the reason I'm asking is I had a guest on that talked about some of the horse trading, some of that negotiation that happens at maybe a different stakeholder level. And sometimes the team shouldn't hear that because that might be negatively impactful. They might start worrying about things just because, they might be concerning or they're not privy to the rest of the conversation and it's hard to understand. So I guess when it comes to your perspective of what and how much you communicate to your team, what do you do to make sure that you don't upset the high impact culture that you've established?
Years ago, one of my mentors taught me this leadership concept of 80-10-10. What that meant more in this context was 80% of the information is meant for 80% of the masses. What I mean by that is, look, there's lots of information the company has. You think about the formality of the goals. You think about formality of the structure. There's lots of information that is surprisingly, not well trickled down to the masses and needs to be. That may include things about, hey, we all need to, imbibe to an agile culture. Let's say in tech, hey, we need to do a little bit more, CI/CD, whatever that is. That's 80% of the information that's meant for everybody, and repeat that multiple times. Everybody gets it. The next 10% refers to that 10% of the content is meant for 10% of the time with an individual. So now you're talking one-on-one. Now you're talking, look, this is not meant for the masses. This is for an individual with a leader, me with my directs. And what do I need to let them know so they can process it for themselves and how they run with it. That's only 10%, not to be mixed with. And the last 10% is what we call as an unspoken truth. Doesn't have to be spoken, doesn't have to be verbal, doesn't have to be a lot of times written. But that 10% is the one that separates between what's otherwise communicated and what we want the leaders to know. Here is the for example, here is where the forward-looking challenges for the group are. Everything cannot be, you call the last 10% is the ambiguity. That's the ambiguity. I mean, if I were to express every bit of that, then we're operating with 100% clarity. In reality, it's not possible to operate with 100% clarity. You can operate with 90% clarity and that 10% ambiguity. But me as a leader, how am I communicating the ambiguity? What portion am I leaving it for them to deduce? So I usually follow that 80-10-10. And my leaders follow their 80-10-10. So you sort of, now if you look at it, the number shrinks. By the time it gets to the rank and file, the ambiguity level goes down and down and down, trickling to the point where an engineer who just started a week ago, fresh out of a college, his or her ambiguity is shred to nothing. But a senior leader, a part of my organization, who perhaps has let's just say 25 years of experience in the mix, should tolerate and handle a certain level of ambiguity in this work.
Absolutely. I like that a lot. It's an interesting conversation because I think as I've been listening to you, there is a certain amount of obviously there's a lot of art to this. It's less science, all art, because I think a lot of times understanding what, when, and how is far more challenging. Vijay, if somebody does want to reach out to you to talk to you about something you mentioned on the podcast around leadership, obviously we've been talking about, what's a good way of finding you and connecting with you?
I'm a very socially available person. LinkedIn is probably the easiest way to get hold of me, given that it's pretty prevailing. Obviously I have my key contact information there. That's the best way to reach them. That also allows me to, sort of expose them and introduce them to great content like what you provide out there as well.
Absolutely. I definitely appreciate your time. Thanks for being on. Thanks for sharing. I thought that was fantastic.
Amit, thank you for having me. As always, you bring lots of, let's say, verve to the technology, space out there. And, thank you for what you do there.
I appreciate it, Vijay. Thank you very much. We'll put your LinkedIn in the show notes. If somebody does want to reach out to you and kind of continue the conversation, they could do that. So that's it for this episode. And I'll be back again, different guest, different topic. Until then, two things. So one, we had this conversation with Vijay around low churn, high impact team culture. I think this is very widely applicable. Some great insights in terms of how he runs his teams and what he does to ensure that the team is focused and executing, but also aware of all those little nuances that could potentially upset the team and the dynamics. I think that's really important. He told us a little bit about how he goes through and handles communicating with his team, because obviously he's operating at a little bit different level and lens and can't communicate everything. You got to be aware of how that impacts the team. So please share this episode with somebody else who's interested in team culture, high impact, and low churn. I'd appreciate that. Also, like, subscribe, comment, leave me a review on the podcast wherever you listen to this. I'd appreciate that. It'd be great for the show. Until next time, thank you and goodbye.